Hey everyone. Now I want to start talking about the different parts and pieces of the digestive system, the different anatomy and physiology of the digestive system. And what I want you to keep in mind is that from an anatomical perspective, there's two different components to the digestive system. And the first is the alimentary canal. And the alimentary canal is the long continuous tube that runs from the mouth all the way down to the anus. And this is also called the digestive tract, the gastrointestinal tract, our gut, the alimentary canal. These are all terms for the long continuous tube that runs from the mouth to the anus. So just to briefly go through it, we have the mouth, and the mouth becomes the pharynx or the throat, which becomes the esophagus. Then we get down into the stomach. Then that gives way to the small intestines. Then we get into the large intestine, and that becomes the rectum and the anus. So that's the alimentary canal. And this is the canal that food is going to pass through as we try to break down those nutrients and absorb them into the bloodstream. And the other component are what we call accessory organs. And these accessory organs are not part of the canal itself, but they contribute to digestive processes. And today we're going to start in the oral cavity. So the oral cavity is part of the alimentary canal, but there's also a couple accessory organs in there as well. So what are a couple accessory organs, digestive organs you can think of in the oral cavity? Well, one, we have teeth. Teeth are going to contribute to mechanical breakdown. It's going to break down that food. We also have the tongue. The tongue is going to be involved in mechanical breakdown. It's also going to be involved in propulsion or swallowing. So those are a couple examples of accessory organs. But the remainder of the accessory organs, or what a lot of these accessory organs have in common, is that they are located outside of the alimentary canal, but they make and secrete products into the alimentary canal. And those are going to contribute to digestive processes. So some examples of this are the salivary glands, the pancreas, the liver. These are all accessory organs that are located outside of the alimentary canal, but they're going to make products and secrete those products via ducts into the alimentary canal, and that's going to contribute to digestive processes. And again, we're going to go through the oral cavity today. And so we have these salivary glands, and what are these salivary glands going to do? Well, they're going to produce saliva, and they're going to secrete that saliva via ducts into the oral cavity, and that's going to help with various digestive processes. Now, as we make our way down through the digestive tract, through the digestive system, we're going to encounter different physiological processes and different types of activities, different things that are going on. And pretty much all of those can be categorized into one of the following. So these are the different digestive tract activities that we are going to encounter as we go through the digestive system. So let's take a look at those. The first is ingestion. And this is simply the act of taking food and putting it into the digestive tract, putting it into the mouth. You're at dinner and you have a plate in front of you and you fork up some of that food and you voluntarily put that into your mouth. That's ingestion. And where does that occur? That only occurs one place. That occurs at the mouth or the oral cavity. The next digestive activity is propulsion. And propulsion is the act of moving food through the gastrointestinal tract. All right, we ingest this food and we have to keep it moving as it goes all the way through the GI tract. And so propulsion is going to occur in every location along the GI tract. It's going to occur in the mouth, the pharynx, the esophagus, the stomach, the small intestine, large intestine, rectum, and anus. Okay, the food bolus is constantly being propelled through the GI tract. The next is mechanical breakdown. And mechanical breakdown refers to physically breaking down food into smaller and smaller pieces. And the reason we're doing that is because, one, we want to prepare it into this homogeneous mixture. But two, we're also trying to increase the surface area of that food. We're trying to expose the nutrients in that food so the enzymes can come in and digest them. We're trying to increase the surface area for digestion. And so where's mechanical breakdown going to occur? Where's the first place mechanical breakdown is going to occur? Well, that's going to occur in the oral cavity. Our teeth and our tongue are involved in moving that food around in the oral cavity and breaking it down, breaking it into smaller components, making it into this homogeneous mass. Where's the next place we're going to encounter mechanical breakdown? Well, the next place is going to be the stomach. So the food is going to hang out a while in the stomach, and while it's in there, it's going to be churned around. Okay, remember that the stomach is sealed off because of a couple sphincters. You have the lower esophageal sphincter and you have the pyloric sphincter. And so that food is going to stay there for a while and it's going to be churned around. The smooth muscle layers of the stomach are going to churn that food around. They're going to mix it around. And by doing so, they're going to be mechanically breaking it down. What about the small intestine? That's the next location. Are we going to have mechanical breakdown in the small intestine? And the answer is yes. And we'll go through this specific type of movement, but basically the smooth muscle layers in the small intestine are going to be moving this food back and forth and pinching it in half. Okay, move it this way, pinch it in half, move it that way, pinch it in half. And by doing so, it's going to be mixing it together. It's going to be breaking it down and it's going to be mixing it together. And that specific motion in the small intestine is called segmentation. And then we're going to get into the large intestine, and there may be a little mechanical breakdown in the large intestine because it does get moved around back and forth a little bit in there within these pouches called haustra, but not a whole lot of that is going to occur. So the main areas that mechanical breakdown are going to occur is in the oral cavity, in the stomach, and also in the small intestine. The next digestive tract activity is digestion. And digestion refers to chemically breaking down nutrients into smaller units. And this occurs via enzymes. There's enzymes in the digestive tract that are going to chemically break down nutrients into smaller units. And why are we doing that? Why are we taking these nutrients, carbohydrates, proteins, lipids, and breaking them down, breaking the chemical bonds between those molecules and breaking them down into smaller components. We're doing that because that allows for absorption, the movement of those nutrients across the digestive tract wall. So for instance, proteins, we want to break down into, what do we want to break proteins down into so they can be absorbed, so they can move from the digestive tract into the blood? We're going to break those down into individual amino acids. What about long strings of carbohydrates, polysaccharides? What are we going to break those down into? We're going to break those down into monosaccharides. And then lipids, which are made up of, they're not necessarily polymers, but we're going to take these lipid droplets and we're going to take the triglycerides within them and we're going to cleave off the glycerol and cleave off the fatty acids. So we're going to break down those triglycerides into their individual parts. And again, it's going to be enzymes that are responsible for this. So where does digestion occur in the digestive tract? Well, maybe surprisingly, the first place it's going to occur is in the oral cavity. We're actually going to start to break down carbohydrates, not a whole lot of breakdown, but we're going to start to break down carbohydrates in the oral cavity. And there's enzymes in the saliva that are going to do that. Okay, what's the next location? The next location is going to be the stomach. And does anybody have any idea what nutrients we're going to start to break down in the stomach? This is where we're going to start to break down proteins. Okay, the stomach is super acidic, so it's going to unravel those proteins, and then we have enzymes in there specifically called pepsin, an enzyme called pepsin that's going to start to break the bonds between those individual amino acids. But the primary place, the main location where digestion is going to occur is in the small intestine, the duodenum, the jejunum, and the ileum. And the food spends quite a bit of time in the small intestine because that's where most of digestion is going to take place. Carbohydrates, proteins, and lipids are all going to be digested in the small intestine. This is where the vast majority of digestion occurs, and all the macromolecules are broken down, are digested in this location. Okay. Next we have absorption. And absorption is the movement of these digested end products from the digestive tract into the blood supply. So they have to physically move across the wall of the digestive tract to enter into the blood supply, where they can be sent to the cells of the body, and the cells of the body have access to them. So where does absorption occur? Well, a little bit of absorption probably does occur in the oral cavity. You've heard of sublingual medication, where that's medication you put under your tongue, and then it can dissolve through the epithelium and get into the blood supply. So there probably is a little bit of absorption that occurs in the oral cavity, but it's not really built for that. Okay, the epithelium there is stratified squamous epithelium. That's not really meant for absorption. So, it's got to be like a fat soluble substance or something that can just pass through those cells. Anyways, so maybe a little bit in the oral cavity, but not much. What about the stomach? Again, there's probably a little bit of absorption that occurs in the stomach. I'm actually not super up to verse on the specifics of that. Proteins are broken down there, but I don't believe there's a lot of protein absorption there. And what I'm getting at here is the primary site of absorption is going to be in the small intestine. Okay, the vast majority of absorption, nearly all of the absorption, I should say, of proteins, carbohydrates, and lipids are going to occur in the small intestine. Okay, this is where the majority of it occurs, as well as vitamins, vitamin absorption, mineral absorption, water absorption is all going to occur in the small intestine. What about the large intestine? There is some absorption that occurs at the large intestine. In fact, there's a lot of water absorption because at this point we pretty much extracted most of the nutrients that we need. And so now we're just trying to prepare it for elimination from the body. And so that involves a lot of water absorption, getting water out of it, okay, and compacting it down. A lot of our gut microbiome is located in the large intestine, and these bacteria are responsible for producing some of our B complex vitamins. And so we have these vitamins, B vitamins, that are produced in the large intestine, and then they also get absorbed in the large intestine. And so there definitely is absorption that occurs at the large intestine. What color should I choose for defecation? And then the last digestive activity is defecation. And this is pretty much eliminating anything that we couldn't digest out of the body. This food has gone all the way through the digestive tract. We've done everything we can with it. And then anything that we cannot digest, we cannot absorb, needs to be eliminated from the body. We're through with it. And that's what defecation is, eliminating indigestible substances from the body. And that occurs at the anus. And what comes out is feces. So that's it. As we go through all the different parts of the digestive tract, the digestive system, we're going to encounter these different digestive activities. And something I dare you to do is because these digestive tract activities, it's efficient, it's necessary, but it's not a pretty process. Okay, what goes on in the digestive tract isn't necessarily a pretty process. And this video goes through it. Okay, it's from the perspective of a baby and this baby eating food, but it goes inside the digestive tract and it shows all of the secretion, all of the mechanical breakdown, all of the mixing that's going on. And, basically is showing all of these different processes. And so it is fascinating, and I think it's worth a look. And so why don't you go ahead and check that out. And then just lastly, before we start talking about the individual parts of the digestive system, I want to take a look at this because this is just telling us how long food stays in each one of these locations. And I think this is important perspective as we go through the digestive tract. So what about the mouth? Well, this is really up to you. Okay, you put food in your mouth, you're chewing it, you're breaking it down. So this is all voluntary. This is up to you. And so we'll just say that food stays in the mouth for, about a minute. But this can be more or it can be less. What about the esophagus? Well, basically all the esophagus is doing is it's moving food from the oral cavity down into the stomach. And so this is just a transit zone. And so food only stays into the esophagus for maybe 4 to 8 seconds, maybe a little bit less. Then we get down into the stomach. It goes through the diaphragm. Now we're down in the abdominal cavity. And this is where the action's going to happen. This is where the food's going to take some time to hang out, because this is where we're starting to actually do a lot of digestion and a lot of absorption. So food is going to stay in the stomach for maybe 2 to 4 hours. Okay, quite a bit of time. And we'll go through the details of this, but basically, it's getting churned around. It's getting mixed together in this acidic environment, into this paste that we call chyme. Proteins are being denatured. They're starting to be broken down. So, all important stuff. So it's going to take 2 to 4 hours there. The small intestine, 3 to 5 hours. Okay, back from that digestive activity, all those digestive activities, something hopefully that you picked up is that the vast majority of digestion and absorption occurs in the small intestine. And this is really the whole point, of the digestive tract. We're trying to take nutrients from food and get them into the blood supply so they can have access to the cells, and the cells can use them for energy and structure and all this kind of stuff. And so, we don't want to mess around here. We want to take our time in the small intestine. So food is staying there from 3 to 5 hours. And then we get down into the large intestine, into the colon, and food can stay there for 10 hours up to several days. And, again, most of the digestion and absorption has already happened, but we're trying to prepare this mass of food now to be eliminated efficiently from the body. So, there's a lot of water absorption. There's a lot of compacting it into a mass called a feces. And this just takes some time to do. It takes 10 hours, maybe up to several days to do. All right, here we go. So we're going to start in the mouth. And the mouth is also called the oral cavity. And remember, cavity is just a term for an open space. And so looking at this picture down below, all of this open space represents the oral cavity. And we're going to have a few different digestive activities that occur in the oral cavity. One, this is where ingestion occurs. Okay, we take food and we put it into the digestive tract through the mouth, through the oral cavity. You have a plate of food in front of you, you pick something up, put it into the oral cavity. So this is where ingestion is going to occur. Mechanical breakdown, quite a bit of mechanical breakdown is going to be involved here, is going to occur in the oral cavity. And it's going to require accessory organs to accomplish that. Specifically, we're going to need the teeth and the tongue for that mechanical breakdown. We're also going to get propulsion that occurs here. And this is going to occur by swallowing. And this is initially a voluntary process. So the initial propulsion that occurs in the digestive tract is swallowing, deciding that you're through with that food in the oral cavity, it's mixed together, and it's time to move it down through the digestive tract. And we're also going to get a little digestion that's going to occur here. I wrote this as chemical breakdown, but that's what we refer to as digestion. And we're going to get a little digestion of carbohydrates, of polysaccharides. And this is going to occur because the salivary glands are secreting saliva into the oral cavity, and there's an enzyme in that saliva that's going to start to break down polysaccharides. It's going to start to break down carbohydrates. Okay, here's a couple different views of the oral cavity. First of all, on the left-hand side, this is a mid-sagittal view of the oral cavity, and so it's a medial view. And I guess we can just start by identifying some borders of the oral cavity. So the upper or superior border is formed by the maxilla and that's the hard palate. So you have the hard palate that forms the upper border of the oral cavity. Posterior to that, you have the soft palate, and then you have the uvula. What's that uvula going to do? Well, during swallowing, it gets pushed up and it seals off the nasal cavity from the oral cavity and prevents food from going up into the nasal cavity. There's the mandible, and then these are kind of the lower borders of the oral cavity. And then in the back of the oral cavity, we have the throat. So actually, in this instance, this little space right there represents the oral cavity. Just that little space represents the oral cavity. Now, what's this structure? What's this big, large structure that's taking up most of this space in the oral cavity? That's the tongue, the big muscular tongue. Then we can look over here. This is an anterior view of the oral cavity. And so now we can see the teeth. We have the teeth up here that are set in the maxilla, the teeth down below that are set in the mandible. Here's the hard palate. There's the soft palate. And there's the uvula down below. Here's the tongue. And below the tongue, we have all of these openings. These little ducts, these little openings. And those are actually the ducts that saliva from the salivary glands are going to be secreted out of into the oral cavity. So the salivary glands produce saliva and they travel through these ducts and then they get secreted into the oral cavity through these openings. And some of these are located beneath the tongue here. What else do we have going on? All right, we have some tonsils in the back of the oral cavity. And what tonsils are is they're lymphatic tissue. And it's lymphatic tissue that has a whole bunch of white blood cells in it. And so as you can imagine, the oral cavity is a great place for bacteria to try to gain entry into the body. And so you want to have watchdogs there. You want to have some security there. And that's what these tonsils are there for. You know, they will attack a little bit of bacteria and destroy a little bit of bacteria. But one of their main roles is that they're a watchdog. So if they encounter something foreign, then they can alert the immune system to that. And so the immune system can elicit a larger response. Now, we do have some dental hygiene folks in this class, and so we'll take a couple slides and talk about the teeth. And first of all, let's talk about something called dentition. And dentition pertains to the arrangement of the teeth in the mouth. And this is the formula for human dentition, the arrangement of the teeth in the human mouth. And so what you can see here is that we have a maxillary set up above, and we have a mandibular set down below. And what we're doing here is actually taking each of these sets and drawing a line right in the middle of it. So for the maxillary set, for instance, we're taking an imaginary line and drawing it mid-sagittally. We're dividing it in half. Okay? And then we're counting the teeth on this half of the midline. And the same thing goes for the mandibular set. We take a line, draw it mid-sagittally, and then we're just going to count the teeth on half of that side of the mouth, on one side of that line. Get a darker color. There we go. So let's start with the maxillary set. And we'll draw our mid-sagittal line. And according to this formula, the first two teeth that we encounter are labeled 2I. What do you think that I stands for? That stands for incisor. So these first two teeth are the incisors, and specifically the first one is the central incisor, and that's the lateral incisor. The next tooth we encounter, they label as 1C. What does that C stand for? That C stands for canine, and so that's our canine tooth. Then it says 2 PM. What does that PM stand for? Those are premolars. So let's see if I can do this. We have 1, 2. And then lastly, we have 3M. And what does that M stand for? Those are our molars. 1, 2, 3. And so, yeah, that's the dentition for the maxillary set. And then obviously, you know, there's the same set on the other side. Where do the wisdom teeth fall into this? Out of all these teeth, where do the wisdom teeth fall into play? Those are actually the third molar. Those are the third molar. And so they're these very last molars in the back. And then we can do the same for the mandibular set down below. And fortunately, the formula is the same. You have a central incisor, a lateral incisor, a canine, two premolars, and then 3 molars. And this individual has not had their wisdom teeth taken out. So the teeth are involved in mechanical breakdown. And each of these teeth look very different, and they're designed to mechanically break down things in different ways. So for instance, the incisors are designed for cutting or nipping off pieces of food. The canines are more fang-like. And so those pierce food and tear food. And then what you'll notice with the premolars and the molars is that they have these broad crowns, these rounded cusps. And so these are really good for grinding material and crushing material, all different types of mechanical breakdown. And these can be really specialized in the animal kingdom, depending on what that animal eats. So why don't you take a second and tell me what specific teeth are being used in these individual scenarios. Okay, first of all, what about this wolf? This wolf has a carcass, and it's reaching into the carcass, and it's grabbing part of it. What is it trying to do? What teeth is that wolf using? Well, that wolf is using its incisors. It's grabbing that food, and it's trying to nip off pieces of food. It's trying to cut off pieces of food. What about this bear? This bear just got a delicious salmon, and what is he doing? Well, he's using his canines. He's piercing that salmon, and he's using that to tear off pieces of salmon. And then lastly, what about this cow or this oxen? Herbivores eat a lot of grass. Well, this animal is using its premolars and molars in the back, and it's grinding that grass together between those crowns, and it's grinding it and crushing it. This diagram is a diagram of the internal anatomy of a tooth. And I don't want to spend too much time on here. I just mainly have this up as reference for people going into dental hygiene so you can look at the different internal anatomy. But something I do want to point out is that here you have that, well, first of all, teeth is bone, and bone is living tissue. And so you have these vessels, you have arteries and veins that are going to move up through this root canal into this pulp cavity. And so all of this living bone tissue can have access to the blood supply. It can get oxygen and nutrients and whatnot and take away waste. Another thing that you have traveling up here, however, are nerves. Okay, you have nerves that branch and make their way up into this pulp cavity. So my question for you is, let's say that you're working in a dentist and you're going to work on this tooth. And what you need to do before you work on that tooth is inject some Novocaine somewhere around this tooth to block the nerve supply, to block the nerve signals that are supplying the tooth, so that patient will not feel pain or discomfort while you're doing that. And my question to you is, which specific nerve, if you inject Novocaine around this tooth, which specific nerve are you trying to block by injecting Novocaine around that tooth? That's my question. And it's the same nerve whether you're working on a maxillary tooth or a mandibular tooth. And I'll give you a hint. It's a cranial nerve. Remember, cranial nerves serve structures of the head and the neck. And so we're thinking of a cranial nerve. So what's the cranial nerve that you are trying to block with Novocaine? And the answer to that is cranial nerve 5, the trigeminal nerve. The trigeminal nerve has 3 different branches. It has this ophthalmic division, it has this maxillary division, and it has this mandibular division. And you can see that these nerves branch, and then they eventually make their way up their root canal into the pulp cavity. And so that's what you're trying to do. You're trying to block, by injecting Novocaine, you're trying to block these different branches of the trigeminal nerve to cut off sensory information from leaving these individual teeth. Moving on to the tongue. There's a lot going on with the tongue. So here's the tongue right here. And the tongue is an accessory organ. It's an accessory digestive organ that's located within the oral cavity. And if we were to cut the tongue open and look at the tissue that the tongue is made out of, we'd find skeletal muscle. So the tongue, inside the tongue, is composed of skeletal muscle fibers. And we call these muscles within the tongue, we call these the intrinsic muscles. Intrinsic meaning within. And these are the muscles that allow us to shape our tongue. Like this elaborate shape right there, which I'm certainly not able to do. But all these movements here of the tongue, within the tongue, are caused by skeletal muscle movements within the tongue. And, what is that important for? Well, changing the shape of the tongue is important for speech, and it's also important for swallowing. We also have skeletal muscles outside of the tongue that are attached to the tongue. And we call these the extrinsic muscles. And all of these skeletal muscles down here that are attached to the tongue, these are called the extrinsic muscles. And what do these do? Well, these allow us to change the position of the tongue, to move the tongue around within the oral cavity. So go ahead and stick your tongue out. Now bring it back in. Now move it side to side within your oral cavity. The reason you're able to do that is because of these extrinsic skeletal muscles. And one thing that I want to point out is that because these are skeletal muscles, we have voluntary control over them. We can voluntarily control the muscles within our tongue as well as these extrinsic muscles. Now, guess what? Skeletal muscles are under the control of the nervous system. So what type of nerve is going to control these movements of the tongue? Well, we're still in the head region, so these are going to be controlled by cranial nerves. And the specific cranial nerve that controls both the intrinsic and the extrinsic muscles of the tongue is cranial nerve 12, the hypoglossal nerve. Hypo meaning below, glossal referring to tongue. So this nerve comes in below the tongue. And you can see, well, one, it's a cranial nerve because here it is coming from the medulla oblongata. And the nerve comes in and you can see it comes up here and it innervates skeletal muscles within the tongue and also skeletal muscles outside of the tongue, these extrinsic skeletal muscles. So if you have a patient and you want to check function of all their cranial nerves, what can you do to test the function of cranial nerve 12? Well, you can ask them to move their tongue, stick their tongue out, move it side to side within the mouth. And if they have problems doing that or unable to do that, then that indicates damage to the hypoglossal nerve. Now, it's important to keep in mind that these cranial nerves are paired. And so if both nerves are impaired, then the person will not be able to move their tongue around at all. If only one of the hypoglossal nerves on one side of the body is affected, then they will be unable to move only they'll only be able to move part of their tongue. They won't be able to move the part that's affected, that's innervated by the cranial nerve. And also, if somebody has damage to the hypoglossal nerve, then they're going to have problems with speech and swallowing. And again, that's because these intrinsic muscles change shape, and that shape changing is important for speech and swallowing. The tongue has a bunch of different functions besides just being involved in speech and swallowing. So one, it's involved in mechanical breakdown. Okay, it's going to be, when you have food in your mouth, it's going to be gripping food and constantly repositioning it between the teeth. So it's involved in mechanical breakdown. It also mixes food with saliva, and it forms it into a compact mass that we call a bolus. And what this is it's a rounded mass of food that we're basically preparing for swallowing. So we're trying to make it into this homogeneous mixture, this rounded mass of homogeneous mixture that we're going to prepare for swallowing. The tongue is involved in swallowing, and it's actually it's really the only voluntary part of propulsion that occurs in the digestive tract is initiating swallowing by the tongue. And so the tongue is going to initiate swallowing by pushing this food bolus posteriorly or backwards towards the throat. Some other things that are going on with the tongue. There are taste buds within the tongue. You have what are called these different papilla. Papilla is a term that you'll see throughout in many places with regards to anatomy. There's renal papilla, adrenal papilla, and really all that means is nipple-shaped, dermal papilla. So anything nipple-shaped you call a papilla. And you have these papilla on the tongue. The foliate papilla, valate papilla, fungiform papilla. And within these little structures are taste buds, which are little chemoreceptors that detect taste and then take that to the brain for processing. The immune system is also located in the tongue. We have tonsils. These are called lingual tonsils. And what tonsils are is they're lymphatic tissue. And one of the jobs of the lymphatic system is to house white blood cells. So there's a bunch of white blood cells within this lymphatic tissue, within these tonsils. And again, those are there to monitor for any potential pathogens that may be entering into the body, into the digestive tract via this food. And then lastly, because we can change the shape of the tongue, those intrinsic muscles, changing the shape of the tongue helps us in speech. And specifically, it helps us form consonants, D, K, T. All of these different consonants when we speak. The reason we're able to do that is because the tongue is changing shape. Next, we move on to salivary glands. And salivary glands, like the teeth and the tongue, are an accessory organ, an accessory digestive organ. But they're a little bit different because the salivary glands are located outside of the oral cavity, and they're going to make and secrete a product into the oral cavity. So they lie outside of the alimentary canal, and then they make and secrete a product into the alimentary canal. So there are 3 different salivary glands that are paired. They're on each side of the face. And the first one is the parotid gland. And the parotid gland is this large salivary gland that's located pretty superficially. It's right beneath the skin in front of the ear. And the parotid gland is going to make saliva, and it's going to secrete that saliva via this duct into the oral cavity. Another salivary gland is the sublingual gland. And where is this one located? It's located underneath the tongue, sublingually. And there's actually quite a few ducts that are going to come from the sublingual gland and secrete that saliva into the oral cavity. And the final salivary gland is the submandibular gland, and that is located underneath the mandible. Here's the mandible, and there's the submandibular gland. And again, it's going to produce saliva and secrete that saliva via a duct into the oral cavity. So what is saliva? Well, saliva is a watery solution. Any solution prepared by the body is going to be mostly water, and it's going to contain ions, enzymes, it's going to contain ions, it's going to contain mucus, and it has multiple different functions. It's going to cleanse the mouth. It's going to dissolve food chemicals so they can be tasted. It's going to moisten the food, which helps in mechanically breaking it down and preparing it into a bolus. There are lysozymes in there, and lysozymes are an antibacterial enzyme. And so they're going to attack bacteria that are in the mouth and prevent overgrowth of oral microbial populations. And if you remember from our earlier discussion, chemical digestion is also going to occur in the oral cavity. And that's because the saliva contains an enzyme called salivary amylase that's going to start the breakdown of carbohydrates. It's going to start the breakdown of starch. Here's a starch molecule, and it's moderately branched, and each one of these individual units are monosaccharides, and specifically they're glucose units. And before these carbohydrates can be absorbed, move into the blood, they have to be broken down into individual monosaccharides. And salivary amylase is going to start that process. And what it does is it actually starts breaking the starch down into disaccharides. Okay, so it gets that process going. And relatively speaking, food isn't hanging out in the mouth for an extended period of time. So there's not a whole lot of carbohydrate, not a whole lot of starch digestion that's occurring, but it does start here. Now, how are these salivary glands controlled? What controls the secretion of saliva from the salivary glands? Is there just kind of a constant amount just being produced and secreted? or is there something that stimulates the release? And the answer to that is that glandular tissue is under the control of the nervous system. So the effector organs for the nervous system include skeletal muscle, smooth muscle, cardiac muscle, and glandular tissue. So glandular tissue is under the control of the nervous system. And my first question to you is, which branch of the nervous system, which motor branch of the nervous system is going to innervate these salivary glands and cause the secretion of saliva? And the answer to that is the autonomic nervous system. And there are two branches of the autonomic nervous system. There is the sympathetic division, the fight or flight division, and there's the parasympathetic division, the rest and digest division. And so my next question is, which of these two divisions is going to stimulate the release of saliva from the salivary glands? The sympathetic system or the parasympathetic system? And the answer to that is the parasympathetic nervous system. Okay, parasympathetic, rest and digest, put on a pair of slippers. And you're eating a meal. When do you need to release saliva? You need to do that when you're eating a meal. And that's part of the rest and digest response. And not surprisingly, those parasympathetic motor neurons are going to travel through cranial nerves to get to the specific salivary glands. And there are two different cranial nerves involved. One is cranial nerve 7, the facial nerve. And there's a few different branches of this, but you can see here it's starting in the medulla oblongata somewhere. And parasympathetic neurons are going to travel through this cranial nerve, and they're going to stimulate saliva release from the sublingual and the submandibular glands. Then we also have cranial nerve 9, which is the glossopharyngeal nerve. So parasympathetic neurons are going to travel through the glossopharyngeal nerve and stimulate salivary release from the parotid gland. And this should, if you remember back to your anatomy of the autonomic nervous system, parasympathetic motor neurons they start from the brainstem, and they start from the sacral region of the spinal cord. The parasympathetic system is also called the craniosacral division because the motor neurons originate from the cranium, from the brainstem, and the sacrum. Whereas the sympathetic nervous system is the thoracolumbar division, and those motor neurons originate from the thoracic and the lumbar regions of the spinal cord. Our next stop along the alimentary canal is going to be the pharynx, also known as the throat, and the esophagus. And there are some interesting things going on with the pharynx and esophagus, especially with regards to the nervous system. But as far as digestive activities are concerned, the only digestive activity that the pharynx and esophagus are going to perform is propulsion. Their only job is to serve as passageways to pass food from the mouth down into the stomach. And so propulsion is their only digestive activity. Let's start by taking a look at the pharynx, also called the throat. So here's the oral cavity, And the next part of the alimentary canal after the oral cavity is the throat. And this entire region right there represents the throat. And there's 3 different parts to it. This upper portion is called the nasopharynx. Why is this called the nasopharynx? It's called the nasopharynx because it's continuous with the nasal cavity. The next component, the next portion, is this right there, and that's called the oropharynx. Why is that called the oropharynx? Well, because it's continuous with the oral cavity. And then the next region, the last region, is called the laryngopharynx. And the reason it's called the laryngopharynx is because it's right in back of this structure right here, which is part of the respiratory system that we call the larynx. And the larynx is composed of a bunch of different cartilages and ligaments, and it serves as the passageway for air down into the trachea. And you also have the vocal folds or the vocal cords that are located in the larynx. So what is the job, what is the purpose of the pharynx? Well, during breathing, it serves as an air passageway to get air from the nasal cavity and the oral cavity into the larynx and the trachea. So you breathe in air through the nasal cavity, and it passes from the nasal cavity back down through the throat, and it goes from the throat and it enters the larynx, and then it goes down the trachea or the windpipe. So it's an air passageway. During swallowing, the pharynx also serves as a food passageway. So it's going to pass food from the oral cavity into the esophagus. So here you're working on a food bolus, mechanically breaking it down. Then you initiate the swallowing process, and that food bolus passes from the oral cavity into the oropharynx, into the laryngopharynx, and then down into the esophagus. So I have a question for you. The alimentary canal, the long continuous tube that runs from the mouth all the way down to the anus, is a mucous membrane. And all membranes are lined by epithelium. That means that the oral cavity, the throat, and the esophagus are all lined by epithelium. And my question to you is, what type of epithelium do you think lines the oral cavity, the oropharynx, the laryngopharynx, and also the esophagus? What type of epithelium do we find there? And I'll give you a hint. This is a picture. This is histology of that epithelium. This is the epithelial sheet. And then underneath you have connective tissue. So what type of epithelium is that? First of all, is it simple or is it stratified? Does it have a single layer of cells or many layers of cells? Well, it has lots of layers of cells, so it's stratified. And then what's the cell shape up here in the most superficial region? That's squamous. So this is stratified squamous epithelium. And my next question is, why does stratified squamous epithelium line the oral cavity, the oropharynx, the laryngopharynx, and also the esophagus? What purpose does this epithelium provide? It provides protection, and specifically physical protection. So you imagine if you're chewing a food bolus in the mouth and then you swallow that bolus, it's going to move through the oral cavity, through the pharynx and into the esophagus, and as it does so, it's going to be rubbing up against the wall of these structures. And so the stratified squamous epithelium, that's moving down, it's going to protect the underlying connective tissue from that food bolus. You know, you may have some of these squamous cells that slough off, but that's okay. That's what they're made for. And then you have stem cells down below that are constantly producing new cells and regenerating that stratified squamous epithelium. Now let's talk about the process of swallowing. And swallowing is moving food from the oral cavity into the stomach. Moving food from the oral cavity down into the stomach. And there's 3 different phases of swallowing. The first is the oral or the voluntary phase, and that's what we're going to talk about first. The next is the pharyngeal phase, the phase that occurs in the throat, and this is involuntary. And then the next phase is the esophageal phase, moving food down through the esophagus, and this is also involuntary. So this food is in your mouth, and the teeth, tongue, and saliva are all mixing it together, mechanically breaking it down, and preparing it, homogenizing it into a food bolus, which prepares it for swallowing. And this is all voluntary, right? You're chewing your food voluntarily, mixing it around voluntarily. Well, the first part, at that point, when you've mixed it together and you're ready to swallow the food, that's what constitutes the voluntary phase of swallowing, the oral or the voluntary phase. So it's a conscious decision, a voluntary decision to swallow that food. And when you do that, the tongue pushes the food bolus up against the hard palate and then moves it backwards toward the oropharynx. And that's what the voluntary phase is. And something I want to point out is that it is voluntary. You decide when you want to swallow that food, but once you decide that, the actual process involves a lot of motor memory. So the tongue is made up of skeletal muscles inside the tongue and outside of the tongue, so it's all voluntary. But again, when you decide to swallow, all of those specific actions where the tongue is going to push that food bolus up and back into the back of the throat, that's a lot of motor memory. You're not thinking about all the different skeletal muscle contractions that go into that. It's something that you've learned over time. The next phase of swallowing is the pharyngeal phase. And the pharyngeal phase is involuntary. In fact, all propulsion from this point onward is involuntary. The only voluntary component of propulsion is that initial swallowing reflex in the oral cavity when you decide to swallow that food. Everything else from here on out is involuntary. So this pharyngeal phase, it's rapid, it's sequential, and it all occurs within about a second. And it's driven by a reflex. It's a reflex between the pharynx and the brainstem. And they're still trying to figure out all the complexities of this reflex, but they think it may be the most complex reflex driven by the central nervous system is this pharyngeal phase of swallowing. But there's pretty much three crucial features of what's going on. The first is food passage, and this involves propelling the bolus through the pharynx, through the upper esophageal sphincter, which is probably about there, and propelling it into the esophagus. So there's that food passage phase. Through the pharynx, through the upper esophageal sphincter, into the esophagus. And the other component is airway protection. So here we have a picture of, well, this is the pharynx. This is the esophagus. This is the larynx. And then down below is the trachea. And normally when you're just breathing, this component of the larynx, that's called the epiglottis, is in the upward position. And that allows air to move in through the larynx into the trachea. But when you're swallowing food, obviously we don't want food going down the larynx and the trachea. If that's happened to you before, where food or liquid goes down there, it elicits a very violent coughing reflex. So what happens during the pharyngeal phase of swallowing is this larynx elevates, and when it does that, the tongue pushes back and it tips down the epiglottis. So the epiglottis seals off the larynx. And so that means that food is going to go from the laryngopharynx down into the esophagus, and it prevents it from going into the larynx and the trachea. And so that's let's use this here. That's the epiglottis that gets tipped down. But another thing that happens is we want to seal off the nasopharynx. We don't want food going up into our nasal cavity. And so part of that pharyngeal phase of swallowing is that the soft palate and the uvula get tipped upward, and they seal off the oral cavity from the nasal cavity and prevent food from going up into the to the nasal cavity. And if you're ever laughing, if you're ever eating food and laughing, then this uvula is going to be going up and down, and that allows food to go up into the nasal cavity. And so that's how you can get some rice up there or something to that effect. And something that I want to point out is that this pharyngeal phase of swallowing is driven largely by skeletal muscles. And these are just a small example of some of the skeletal muscles that are involved in the pharyngeal phase of swallowing. And you think of skeletal muscles, and skeletal muscles are under voluntary control. We can voluntarily control these. But during the pharyngeal phase of swallowing, this is all involuntary. And so what that means is that, you have this sensory stimulus in the oral cavity, like pressure or, food chemicals that's going to stimulate this reflex. And that information goes to the brainstem, and the brainstem turns around and it causes involuntary constriction of these skeletal muscles. And these pharyngeal muscles are going to contract sequentially. So first the upper one, then the middle, and then the lower. And what that's doing is as each one of those contracts, it's pushing that food bolus down through the pharynx and into the esophagus. And guess what type of nerves are going to come from the brainstem and cause constriction of these pharyngeal muscles? These are cranial nerves. And, there's a lot of problems that can occur with swallowing. And a lot of that is nervous system related. So this table here, table 1, these are the major muscles related to swallowing and also the cranial nerves that control them. So like I said, there's a whole host of different muscles, skeletal muscles that are involved in the swallowing reflex. And these are all the different cranial nerves that are responsible for their innervation. And why is that important to know? Well, if you have dysfunction with swallowing, then it may be nervous system dysfunction. It may be dysfunction with some of these cranial nerves. And we call this dysphagia. We call any type of abnormal swallowing dysphagia. And this can arise from functional or structural deficits anywhere along the oral cavity, pharynx, esophagus, or the esophageal sphincters. Anywhere along this swallowing pathway, any type of functional deficit, especially related to the nervous system, or any type of structural deficit can result in abnormal swallowing or dysphagia. And this is particularly prevalent in older individuals. And this table just shows some of the different causes of different forms of dysphagia, in this case in the oral cavity and in the pharynx. And a lot of these are neurologically related. Neurological disorders or strokes. Even psychiatric disorders. Or you can get more structural abnormalities, connective tissue diseases. And this is a serious problem. We take swallowing for granted. We take a lot of things for granted until something wrong goes with them. But it can lead to serious complications, including dehydration, malnutrition, airway obstruction, and just the social debilitation of it all. Next, we move on to the esophagus. And the esophagus is a supramuscular tube whose job it is to deliver food from the throat, get it down through the thoracic cavity, and move it into the stomach. So if we were to put the diaphragm here, the diaphragm would be located about there. We have pleural cavities on each side that contain the lungs. Pericardial cavity would be about right there. And so it's the job of the esophagus to move the food bolus down through the thoracic cavity, past the heart, past the lungs, and get it into the stomach. And this doesn't take very long, only a few seconds to get it there. Here you can see the esophagus moving down through the thoracic cavity. Here's the pharynx, and it gives way to the esophagus. And a couple things that I want to point out. One is that the esophagus runs posterior to or in back of the trachea. Here's the trachea, your windpipe. And the esophagus runs in back of that. Here's the aortic arc. And again, the esophagus runs in back of that. So it's running in back of the heart. And then here's the diaphragm, which separates the thoracic from the abdominal cavities. And the esophagus goes through the diaphragm. There's a hole in it where it can pass through. And then there's a sphincter right there called the lower esophageal sphincter. And food moves through the lower esophageal sphincter into the stomach. And that takes us to the esophageal phase of swallowing, which is involuntary. And basically what is going to happen is that, well, let's take a look at the diagram. Here's the pharynx. And when food moves from the pharynx into the esophagus, it's going to trigger a series of smooth muscle contractions that we call peristalsis. It's going to trigger a series of what we call peristaltic contractions involving the smooth muscle layer of the esophagus. And that is going to propel that food bolus all the way through the esophagus into the stomach. Here we have some histology. This is a nice histology figure of the esophagus. And from right about there to right about there, that's the mucosa layer. Here's the epithelium in that. What type of epithelium is that? That's stratified squamous epithelium. And then beneath that is the underlying connective tissue, which is going to be areolar tissue. Then you get into the submucosal layer, which is about right there. The outer layer is the serosa. That's the visceral peritoneum. But then we have these two thick layers right there. These two thick layers. And this is the muscularis externa. These are two smooth muscle layers. This is the inner circular layer, and this is the outer longitudinal layer. And as you can see, it's super thick. It's really thick. And so the smooth muscle contractions that are driving this food bolus down the esophagus are going to be strong. And if you had to take a guess of which one of these smooth muscle layers is primarily involved in moving that food bolus down the esophagus, then which one would it be? It's going to be this inner circular layer, because when it contracts, it pinches, and that closes the lumen and propels the food bolus on down. Let's take a closer look now at how this food is actually moving through the GI tract. And like I mentioned in the previous slide, this is going to occur through a process called peristalsis. And peristalsis is a series of contractions and relaxations of the smooth muscle layer that's going to propel that food down through the alimentary canal. And this is all involuntary. Peristalsis is the primary form of propulsion that's going to move food all throughout the alimentary canal. So it not only occurs in the esophagus, but it's also going to occur in the stomach, the small intestine, and the large intestine. And what's interesting about peristalsis is that it's going to involve a component of the nervous system called the enteric nervous system. And enteric refers to the gut. It's referring to the alimentary canal. And what the enteric nervous system is it's a mesh-like system of neurons that's embedded in the lining of the GI tract, of the gastrointestinal tract. And it can work on its own, which means that it doesn't need to send input to the central nervous system for it to cause things to happen. So what that means is it can govern a lot of the activities of the digestive tract on its own without any input of the central nervous system. And this is a good example. Peristalsis is a good example of how this works. And I'll give you just a kind of a brief rundown of how that works here, and then I'll show a little more specific on the next slide. So here we have this food bolus. And how is this food bolus going to go down? Well, what happens is that when the food bolus moves down, it activates stretch receptors in the wall of the GI tract. And those stretch receptors act back on other neurons that are also within the wall of the GI tract. And those what are now motor neurons act on the smooth muscle in back of the bolus, and they cause constriction of that smooth muscle. And that causes that pinches the alimentary canal and causes the food bolus to move down. Then the food bolus moves down, and guess what? It stimulates stretch receptors further down. Which act back and stimulate motor neurons that cause smooth muscle contraction in back of the bolus. And at the same time, so I'll do these same neurons are acting back and activating motor neurons that are going to cause relaxation of smooth muscle in front of the bolus. So we're not only getting contraction in back of the bolus, but we're getting relaxation of the smooth muscle in front of it. And for the most part, this solely involves the enteric nervous system. All of these neurons that I'm talking about here are embedded in the wall of the GI tract. It doesn't need to go to the central nervous system for this to occur. This is a really nice figure of the enteric nervous system within the walls of the alimentary canal. So let's orient ourselves first of all. Here's the mucosa layer. Here's the submucosal layer. Here's the circular layer of smooth muscle. And here's the longitudinal layer of smooth muscle. And then the serosa layer would be superficial to that. But there's basically two locations where we find the majority of neurons for the enteric nervous system. One of those is located in the submucosa, and this is called the submucosal plexus. If I had to define what a plexus is in the context of the nervous system, I would say it's a collection and convergence of neurons. So it's a place where neurons are collecting and converging together. And you can probably look up a more official definition. But one of the places that we find neurons of the enteric nervous system is in the submucosa, in this submucosal plexus. And then another location that we find a majority of these neurons is in between the two muscle layers in what we call the myenteric plexus. So these are two distinct locations within the alimentary canal that we find the enteric nervous system. The submucosal plexus and the myenteric plexus. So how does this work to drive peristalsis? Well, it's actually it's pretty simple, and it's basically a reflex loop. And how does it start? Well, it starts with distension or stretch of the mucosa layer. So you have a food bolus that's moving down, and as it moves down, it stimulates sensory receptors, stretch receptors in the wall of the mucosa. This is the sensory receptor component there. Action potentials are generated, and it moves down the neuron to the cell body, and then it sends out axons multiple different places. And let's just look at where all of these go. Well, one of those is going to hit this neuron, and this is a motor neuron. And so this motor neuron is stimulated by the sensory neuron. And what does that do? It releases neurotransmitters onto the circular layer of smooth muscle and causes contraction of that smooth muscle. So you have contraction of the smooth muscle in back of the bolus, and that propels it forward. You can also see that the sensory neuron stimulates this series of neurons, and that's going to activate this motor neuron, which is going to release neurotransmitters that are going to cause contraction of the longitudinal layer, and that's going to propel it forward as well. What about in front of the bolus? Well, the sensory neuron activates this motor neuron, which is going to release neurotransmitters and cause relaxation of the smooth muscle in front of the bolus. It's also going to activate this series of neurons that are going to activate this motor neuron and cause relaxation of the longitudinal layer as well. So you get contraction of the smooth muscle in back of the bolus and relaxation of the smooth muscle in front of the bolus. And this is a reflex loop, which means that it can act on its own. This is just another figure to illustrate where in the alimentary canal we find the enteric nervous system. And we can find the two plexuses we talked about. Here's the submucosal plexus, located in the submucosal layer. And then here's the myenteric plexus, which is located within the smooth muscle layers of the GI tract wall. And one thing I want to point out before we move on is that there is external nervous system innervation of the GI tract. There are neurons coming in and there are neurons going out. And so there is communication with the more traditional nervous system, central nervous system that we've talked about. But it can act on its own through the enteric nervous system. And that's really what this diagram is trying to show. This is a review article on the enteric nervous system in Nature Reviews. And it's showing all the different ways that the enteric nervous system can act on its own and in collaboration with other components of the nervous system. So here's the small intestine. And this is showing that peristaltic reflex loop that we just talked about, where you get sensory stimulation that activates a series of neurons, and you get relaxation of the smooth muscle in front of it, and then also you're going to get contraction of the smooth muscle in back of it. That's what this is showing, that the enteric nervous system can act on its own to have digestive effects, to stimulate digestive activities. But there's also, and I don't want to get into the details of this because a lot of it I, completely don't understand as well. But here's the central nervous system. Here's the brainstem and the spinal cord. And so you can see that there are neurons both going to and away from the central nervous system. So sensory information from the GI tract can travel to the brainstem, and then the brainstem can integrate that information and activate motor neurons that travel back to the GI tract and cause different digestive activities to occur. And you can see that occurs from the brainstem all the way down through the through the spinal cord. And they can activate not only sympathetic, but also parasympathetic pathways. Just a couple other things that I want to point out. Again, here we have histology of the esophagus. Here's the mucus layer. And there's the epithelial layer, which we have a close-up over here. And what type of epithelium is that? It's certainly stratified. That's stratified squamous epithelium. The same epithelium that we find on the skin, except this isn't keratinized, but it is stratified squamous epithelium. And then that's the areolar tissue of the mucosa layer below it. Then we have the submucosa layer. And something that we'll find out about more is, just backtracking, the entire alimentary canal is a mucous membrane. The entire alimentary canal is lined by mucus. And when we get to the stomach and the small intestine and large intestine, we'll find that there's little glands called goblet cells within the epithelial layer that are going to secrete mucus. But we don't find those goblet cells in the epithelium of the esophagus. We don't find it within stratified squamous epithelium. So where are the glands that are going to produce this mucus and line the esophagus? Here you can see the esophagus. It has this shiny sheen to it. Well, that's mucus. That's protecting the wall of the esophagus from friction. It's helping food pass down through there. And the answer to that is that we're going to find glands within the submucosa. Within the submucosa, we'll find clusters of glands called esophageal glands. And if we take a close look at those, these are the individual glands. And what type of epithelium is that are going to produce this mucus? That's simple cuboidal epithelium. So that's going to produce mucus. It secretes it into this duct. And then you're going to have ducts that travel through the mucosa layer, and then they're going to secrete that mucus into the lumen. And so it's going to line the stratified squamous epithelium. Good. And then lastly, this is some interesting histology, because this shows the transition of the esophagus as we go from the esophagus and as we go to the stomach, from the esophagus to the stomach. And that's the transition right there. This is the esophagus, and here is our stratified squamous epithelium, which has a protective role. But now, when we move into the stomach, the epithelium changes. I'll use this, will stand out better. So this is the epithelial layer. What type of epithelium is that? That is simple columnar epithelium. And so why are we transitioning from stratified squamous to simple columnar epithelium? What's simple columnar good at? Well, simple columnar is good at making things and secreting things. And so we're really getting down to business here. Food only spent a couple seconds in the esophagus, but now we're going into the stomach. We're going to spend 2 to 4 hours here, and the simple columnar epithelium is going to play a major role because they're going to be secreting products into the stomach that are basically forming gastric juice. And gastric juice is going to do a number of things. But we need that simple columnar epithelium to produce that gastric juice. We're getting down to business now, and we need simple columnar epithelium to do that.